Yeah, so corporations have come to dominate our entire food system. This has been trending since the 1950s, especially. It started to ramp up in the 1960s. We saw as the post-war economy started to boom, and we had more and more corporate mergers, and business became corporate more and more. And then this took off again in the 80s and 90s, and you had merger after merger after merger. And it's important to remember that these are generally approved by both Republican and Democratic administrations. So there's been really a bipartisan acquiescence or support for big business to consolidate its power in every sector of our economy, including food. And food is one of the basic essentials of human life, and there's been no attempt by anybody in politics really to protect us from this. So we've gotten to a situation now where in every sector of our food system, a handful of corporations dominate all of, they control the production system. So, in beef, for instance, we've got just a few companies controlling, 85% of the beef system. Poultry is about 70%, same in hogs. And then you go through all the major commodities and you find that it's 40 to 50% control by these few corporations, by like 4 corporations. And so again, these corporations demand uniform production, mass-scale production of single crops, or this source of factory farms that we were talking about earlier. We talked about demanding that supply. They don't want small producers, so they price them out. They knock them out of business. These corporations control global supply chains. So supply chain is a whole system of production in which the raw ingredients from one stage of production and processing to the next are controlled by different businesses. And at the top, you've got a large corporation that is dictating the final result, whether it's, say, McDonald's or Coca-Cola, which uses tons of corn, or name your fast food operation or supermarket, so all these, food processors and corporations at the top of the food system are saying, this is what we want, this is how we want it. And that drives everything in our food system in terms of how it's produced, who gets to produce it, again, this has all kinds of ramifications for our health and for the environment in terms of driving these monocultures and driving fast production of meat, which then, induces, companies to use hormones and antibiotics and feed them grains that are not healthy for them, that are not healthy for us to eat later. So it's basically a disaster for all of us that a handful of these companies at the very top are driving this whole food system and trading system. So they, Cargill, for instance, has operations in more than 70 countries, and they control so much of the trading and shipping of products. We have, 3 corporations now controlling nearly half of the global seed supply. So it's at every single phase, I call it from seeds to supermarket, where these companies dictate the conditions in which farmers are going to farm and eaters are going to eat. Well, it's an interesting, the question about, local production versus regional and national food production is an interesting one, because I'm not a pure nativist or isolationist in saying, well, every community should produce only its own food and we should all be hermetically sealed communities. I think that a certain aspect of trade, commerce can be beneficial. But I think that overall the switch from local to regional and national has been a bad thing for us, in the sense that it's robbed local communities of the ability to feed themselves. It's turned local farming communities into producers of raw ingredients, essentially, for our food system instead of whole foods. Not talking about the supermarket, by the way, but actual, with a lowercase, whole foods. So we've gotten into the system through, I chart this in my book, Diet for a Dead Planet, looking at the history of American agriculture turning into agribusiness and the industrial farming system, where not only the development of pesticides and heavy machinery, but also canals and railways and refrigerated cars and other things like that, has led us to a situation where we'd have regional specialization going away from local food production. So that meant that suddenly a region was looked at as the nation's producer of fruit or grains or cotton or, you name it, whatever the product would be, or sugar, and so in that situation you had some, farmers getting less diverse in their own food production. The tradition was that farmers would farm, a couple key crops for market, and then produce also food for their own family, or maybe even sell to their local community. They'd have some animals on the farm. They might not even kill them all. They might be for eggs and milk. And we've gone away from that diversification, which has been beneficial to soils and to farm economies and farmers' income. We've gone radically away from that to the point where more and more farms have one crop or two crops. And maybe they have a small garden patch, for a little bit of supplemental food for their family, but really not much. And another problem with this trend, which is not just in the US, it's global, is that regions around the world are basically pushed by these corporate demands, by trade demands, by capitalism essentially, to become producers of export commodity products instead of producing foods for their community and for themselves. So you get a situation like NAFTA, which has priced Mexican farmers out of corn. Corn being such a vital traditional staple crop in Mexican culture and Mexican rural economies. And so now you have a situation where farmers have gone under in Mexico. Tons of them have come up to the United States in economic desperation, lo and behold, to work in the meatpacking and chicken factories. The animals have been fed American corn that has helped put those farmers out of business. So we've been, and lots of other countries have been forced into this export model where they no longer have staple food production for their communities. And then they're reliant on pesticide contracts, trade contracts with generally these large corporations, unless they can find a fair trade arrangement. So nothing about this is helpful for farmers. I mean, there are examples of farmers who do well at the large scale with global trade or regional trade across country, but by and large, nothing about this is really helping farmers or local environments, local food economies, or again, eaters. So. Starting in the 1930s a little bit, and especially starting to take off in the 1940s, we saw beginnings of pesticide use in American agriculture. A lot of these petrochemicals came out of weaponry and nerve gases from World War II, and World War II, and basically these very toxic chemicals would create a system where bugs would find, most bugs would be killed off. You'd have the sort of super bugs in the Darwinian scenario that would survive, and they would redevelop themselves as stronger bugs, stronger insects, more resistance to that current pesticide. And Rachel Carson, with her book Silent Spring, really started to show us this in the early 1960s when pesticide use was really taking off, where spraying fields across America was killing birds, killing pollinators, killing insects, and you were having more and more of these cycles of resistance where these superbugs would arise, then they would develop more toxic pesticide, and they'd keep cycling through this, where they would just use more pesticides. So they would keep developing stronger, more toxic pesticides and just dumping more and more of them on America's fields. Now we have 800 million pounds of pesticides dumped on our fields every year for our food production, 800 million pounds. So this is also not good for soil. We're using chemical fertilizers, heavy till agriculture, which is, heavy-duty machinery plowing the guts out of the earth. And so we're losing topsoil across America. We're now at a situation where the very rich topsoil across the Midwest, which is sort of considered the grain belt, the breadbasket of America, is shrinking and dying. And in the next 20 to 30 years, we're going to lose just about all of the topsoil in the Midwest. When that soil, and tons of it's already dead, there's no real life in it, so we have to inject, quote, life, temporary life, in the form of chemical nutrients and fertilizers into the soil to make it live, and then use these toxic pesticides. So we're in this really deadly cycle when, before the 1940s and 30s, we had, centuries of organic agriculture where we were not using really any chemicals at all. And, we did okay. There were problems, but we did okay. And we need to go back to a system that is not dependent on ever more chemicals, ever more heavy tillage of the soil, ever more injection of chemical fertilizers. Again, these are also fossil fuel based, so another problem with this, even as we're creating superbugs and then killing them off with more pesticides, is we're using 100 billion gallons of oil in our food supply. So this is entirely unsustainable.